In Unit 7, Module 2, we're going to talk about effective teams and the culture of what makes a team effective. So Google did a bunch of research to find out how to build an effective team at Google. And they went in thinking that it would be about hiring people from top universities and firing all the managers and building everything in these amazing technologies. And the characteristic that they found was most important in building an effective team at Google was psychological safety. That team members felt safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. Number 2 was dependability. Team members get things done on time and meet Google's high bar for excellence. Number 3, structure and clarity. Team members have clear roles, plans and goals. Meaning, work is personally important to team members. And finally, impact. Team members think their work matters and creates change. So, having done some of the reading for this week, perhaps this won't come as a huge surprise to you. But I think the psychological safety and dependability are particularly interesting. And in fact, as part of the research program that I've been working on the last 6 years, some of which I talked about in Unit 6, we actually reproduced some of these results. You'll remember from Unit 6 that we talk about culture, that lean product management practices and continuous delivery don't just impact performance, they also impact culture. What do we mean by that? Well, there's many different models of culture. The one we used in our research comes from a sociologist called Ron Westrom, who studied safety outcomes in healthcare, aviation, and nuclear power. So these are domains where when things go wrong, people die. And what he found was safety culture was about how organizations process information. And he developed a typology which accounts for safety culture in these kinds of organizations where safety is really critical. In this typology, he divides organizations up into pathological, bureaucratic, and generative or performance-oriented, or as I like to call it, mission-oriented. And then he has 6 different axes through which to examine these 3 different types of organization. So first of all is cooperation. Is there low cooperation? Is there modest cooperation? Or do people cooperate very readily? The second axis is about people who bring us bad news. Do we shoot people who bring us bad news? Do we ignore people who bring us bad news? Or do we train people to bring us bad news so we can act on it as soon as possible before problems become failures and become cascading failures which bring down our organization? You'll remember in the reading for this week in John Shook's article in MIT Sloan magazine, he talks about how the American managers would report to their Japanese trainer, and the Japanese manager would say, what problems are you having? And if they said no problems, eventually the Japanese manager said, no problem is a problem. You must bring us your problems so we can solve them. So this is what training messengers is about. Thirdly, how do we deal with responsibilities? Are they avoided because we know that when something goes wrong, we'll be fired? Or are they defined narrowly so that when something goes wrong, we know whose fault it is and we can punish them? Or do we share risks because we know that we succeed or fail as a team? How do we deal with bridging between different departments or bridging between different parts of the organization? Is it discouraged? Don't go and talk to the product people because then they'll find out what we're doing. Do we tolerate it, or do we encourage people working between different departments and working together to achieve shared goals? And then finally, 2 things which are really 2 different sides of the same coin. How do we deal with failure, and how do we deal with novelty? So in pathological organizations, failure leads to scapegoating. If there's some kind of problem, we find out whose fault it was, and then we punish that person. However, in complex organizations, in complex systems, including socio-technical systems like the systems in which we operate, failure is actually inevitable. That's one of the characteristics of complex systems, is failure is inevitable. And it's normally not something that's easy to predict. When something bad happens and you're looking back on the various factors that produce the failure, it's normally quite easy to see why that failure happened. But when you're looking forward before it happens, normally it's very hard to predict that the seemingly innocuous thing that you're doing would lead to a cascading failure in combination with the other various conditions. So any failure investigation that leads to, well, it was Jez's fault, let's fire Jez. Well, guess what? We're going to have to hire someone new into that position, and it's very likely that person will make the same mistake because we haven't changed anything else about the system. So when something goes wrong and you find that someone did something that led to that, the important question to ask is why that person made that mistake. How could we give them better information? How could we give them better tools to help them make better decisions and to catch negative consequences of those decisions more quickly before they become cascading problems? So anytime something goes wrong in a complex system, yes, you've got to do the analysis to find out the factors that contributed to that, but the person or people should not be at the end of that list. When you find a person in the middle of a failure, what you've got to ask is, how can we help, or how could we have helped that person make better decisions? How could we have got them better information? How can we give them better tools? How can we improve information flow through the organization so that the right information gets to the right people at the right time in a way that they can easily understand it? Finally, how do we deal with novelty? Is novelty crushed? Does it lead to problems? Or do we actually implement novelty? And of course, Agile is all about adapting to new information. So in a truly Agile organization, we should be able to respond to and adopt novel ideas. And that's what innovation is, right? But in an organization where failure leads to scapegoating, no one wants to try new things because new things carry a relatively high risk of failure, and failure invites punishment. So in organizations where failure leads to scapegoating, novelty will be crushed. And if you want to build an organization where novelty is possible, you have to build a psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable taking risks because they know that if something goes wrong, that will be treated as a learning experience rather than as a cue for being punished for making mistakes. So, assuming you're in a pathological or bureaucratic organization, how do you move into a generative or performance-oriented organization? And again, this is another area where John Shook's article sheds some really valuable light. John Shook takes this model, which actually comes from a book called The Corporate Culture Survival Guide by Shine, which is in your further reading. And Shine talks about how there's 3 levels to culture. There's the underlying kind of cultural bedrock, then there's people's values and attitudes, and then there's people's behaviors, what they actually do. And traditionally, people seem to believe that you first have to work on the culture, and that will change people's values and attitudes, and then that will change what they do. And John Shook says, well, that's not true. Firstly, we have to change what people do, how they behave. That will in turn change their values and attitudes, and then that will impact culture. And there's actually some interesting evidence that that is in fact the case, that that's how things work. So this model comes from MIT Sloan Review, from John Shook's article. And so in his article, John Shook says, in regards to changing culture, describing his experience at NUMMI, that what changed the culture was giving employees the means by which they could successfully do their jobs. It was communicating clearly to employees what their jobs were and providing the training and tools to enable them to perform those jobs successfully. And so we've talked about some of this, about making sure that you effectively communicate the goals of the team and the organization to people so they can make good decisions autonomously. And also providing the trainings and the tools that people need to be able to do their job. And crucially, giving them the autonomy to do the right thing. In the NUMMI case study, what was different about NUMMI compared to GM was that the people on the production line had the authority to stop the line by pulling the andon cord and then fix the problems they found straight away, including changing the process and getting new tools from engineering in order to be able to improve the process and build quality into the cars in the first place. So this is one of the cornerstones of lean thinking, that The best way to build high quality products is to give people the tools to be able to detect problems and fix them straight away and change their process to improve quality and build quality in. And this has an exact analogy in software delivery, which is the idea of continuous delivery. And the technical practices that contribute to continuous delivery, things like continuous integration, automated testing, trunk-based development, these are all about developers getting fast feedback on their changes and being able to detect and fix them straight away. If you look at things like shifting left on security and database change management, again, those are about building things like security and high-risk changes, building those into the development process and giving developers the tools to find problems and fix them straight away. So this all goes back to one of Deming's 14 points, where he says, cease dependence on mass inspection to achieve quality, improve the process and build quality into the product in the first place. So this is the reason why in our research we hypothesized that continuous delivery practices and lean product development practices, which if you remember things like working in small batches, team experimentation, these are all about creating fast feedback loops and delegating authority to the team to do process improvement, why we believe that they would improve culture. And when we actually went and did the research, we found that that hypothesis was validated. Lean product development practices, lean management practices drive better organizational culture according to Westrom's model, and these technical practices also drive improved organizational culture. So we validated what John Shook said, which is the way you change culture is by changing what people do and how they behave. I want to talk a little bit more about psychological safety with an example actually from a company called Etsy. So we talked about Etsy before in the module on experimental product development. I want to introduce you to Etsy's annual developer conference. And this is John Allspore, who at the time was CTO of Etsy, and Rin Daniels, who is an engineer at Etsy. And what's happening at the annual developer conference is that John is giving Rin an award. It's called the 3-Armed Sweater Award. So it's a sweater with 3 arms, and it's given to the engineer who causes the biggest outage in production in the previous year. And this is not an ironic award. This is actually a thank you. It's thank you for helping us find a problem in our system and helping us fix it so that we can improve the resilience and stability of our systems. And the reason it's a 3-armed sweater is because at the time, the 404 page on Etsy was a picture of a sweater with 3 arms. And so Rin gets the 3-Armed Sweater Award. Thank you very much for helping us find the problem. And you can go and read Rin's blog where they talk about the problem that they found and how when they discovered that the deployment that they were doing was not going to work out, they got on the internal chat system within Etsy and said, well, listen, there's a problem here. And the immediate response from everyone around was to ask, what help do you need? There was bridging, there was collaboration, it was a psychologically safe environment to talk about this problem, and the organization swarmed on it and fixed it, and then gave Rin the 3-Armed Sweater Award to say thank you for helping us improve our organization's resilience. Another example of a psychologically safe culture comes from Google, where every year we do a disaster recovery testing exercise where we build a scenario that takes 2-3 days to execute that scenario. There's a team whose job it is to build that scenario. And one year it was, for example, aliens invade Silicon Valley, and they created a scenario as to what would happen if aliens did invade Silicon Valley. And during this scenario, when they run it, they actually do things like cutting off the fiber connection between Mountain View and the rest of the world and turning off data centers and actually create real damage to the production environment. And then teams have to make sure that their services stay up and meet their service level agreements and there's no user visible impact. The director of the disaster recovery testing team for many years was Kripa Krishnan. And Kripa Krishnan wrote an article about this where she says, for DIRT-style events to be successful, an organization first needs to accept system and process failures as a means of learning. We design tests that require engineers from several groups who might not normally work together to interact with each other. That way, should a real large-scale disaster ever strike, these people will already have strong working relationships. The reason that we've been through all this is because as a product manager, if you expect your team to innovate and to try new ideas, you need to make it psychologically safe for your team to experiment with new ideas, knowing that most of those ideas, as we've seen, will fail. And by giving them the tools to rapidly develop and deploy and test their ideas and do user research so that you can actually build this experimental culture and drive it. So something that's very important to remember as a product manager is that the culture of your organization is crucial. And while it may seem like you don't have the power to change organizational culture, actually you can do it by helping your team change the way they work, building fast feedback loops, giving them tools to build quality in and make sure that when things go wrong, there's a safe way to do a retrospective and find ways to improve and do better. And if you remember the retrospective prime directive, which we talked about at the end of last unit, regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. This is all about accepting failure as a means of learning and trying to create a psychologically safe environment, which is why retrospectives are one of several exercises that you can do to improve psychological safety on your teams.